Now I would like to talk about special protections for vulnerable populations. Well, what do we mean by special protections or safeguards? Well, let's look at the U.S. regulations. A criteria for approval for research studies is as follows. When some or all of the subjects are likely to be vulnerable to coercion or undue influence, such as children, prisoners, pregnant women, mentally disabled persons, or economically or educationally disadvantaged persons, additional safeguards have been included in the study to protect the rights and welfare of these subjects. So what are these additional safeguards? So in the federal regulations, or the common rule, in subpart A, the main regulations, there are no mention of these safeguards. But in the other subparts that deals with pregnant women and prisoners and children, there are safeguards mentioned. Another exercise in this module will look at these specific safeguards for prisoners, and in another module we'll talk about the safeguards for children. But interesting enough, nowhere in the federal regulations are any safeguards mentioned for the mentally ill. In fact, there are no regulations for the mentally ill. More about that in another time. Just a few more words about special protections before we list these special protections. One, a claim to special protection should be understood as an identifiable increased likelihood of incurring additional or greater wrong, meaning that one should get special protection only if there is an increased likelihood of incurring additional or greater wrong. And second, to be vulnerable means to face a significant probability of incurring an identifiable harm while substantially lacking ability and or means to protect oneself. So what are some of the special protections? This slide shows examples of several special protections. One, there has to be the necessity requirement, the physical, mental, social, economic condition that causes the vulnerability is a necessary characteristic of the targeted research population. So if you're investigating a drug for high blood pressure, you would not be justified for testing that drug in a vulnerable population such as those in nursing homes or people who are or people who have dementia. A corollary to the necessity requirement is simply the research cannot be performed by enrolling adults who can consent or who are less vulnerable. Another special protection is that the research is intended to obtain knowledge that will lead to improved diagnosis treatment that is unique to the vulnerable group. Another item is that research subjects and other members of the vulnerable group will have reasonable access to products that become available as a consequence of the research. Another protection is that for people who cannot give their informed consent, we have the presence of proxy or surrogate consent. One may also include additional consent mechanisms. For example, if one plans to enroll people with mild dementia or mild schizophrenia, your IRB may require you to demonstrate that the individual during the consent process has substantially understood the information in the consent form. Another protection mechanism involves limitations on the risk of the study. Fleshing out this concept of special limitations or risk comes from the SIOM's guidelines number 9. It states when there is ethical and scientific justification to conduct research with individuals incapable of giving informed consent, the risk from research interventions that do not hold out the prospect of direct benefit for the individual subject should be no more likely and not greater than the risk attached to routine medical or psychological examination of such persons. This is one definition of minimal risk. And they go on to add a further qualification. Slight or minor increases above such risk may be permitted when there is an overriding scientific or medical rationale for such increases. And we'll see this concept of a minor increment above minimal risk when we talk about research involving children. And let me end by talking about this concept of vulnerable countries. This term, let me start out, may be somewhat controversial. That said, let me move forward with this concept of countries who might be vulnerable, as commentators have suggested that communities in developing and even in developed countries should be considered vulnerable because the populations lack basic rights and freedoms that make them particularly open to exploitation. If we look at SIAM's guidelines number 10, it states, before undertaking research in a population or community with limited resources, the sponsor and the investigator must make every effort to ensure that 1. The research is responsive to the health needs and the priorities of the population or community in which is to be carried out, and 2. Any intervention or product developed or knowledge generated will be made reasonably available for the benefit of that population or community. These two conditions prevent the prospect of any exploitation for any vulnerable groups. We see something similar in the Helsinki Declaration. Medical research involving a disadvantaged or vulnerable population or community is only justified if the research is responsive to the health needs and priorities of that population or community, and the research cannot be carried out in a non-vulnerable population, something similar to what we saw before. And in addition, if there is a reasonable likelihood that the population or community will stand to benefit from the results of the research. Consideration should also be given to ensuring that the community receives a fair level of additional benefits. So the revised Helsinki Declaration has the so-called reasonable availability concept and a fair benefits concept. These are some additional concepts we'll explore in other parts of this certificate program. Thank you very much.